Hello and welcome everyone back to Authors on Tap. My name is Javier Beers, along with Kristen Gilbert. We run Exile in Bucknell here in the gorgeous Fine Arts Building in downtown Chicago. Thank you everyone for showing up tonight. Those here in person and also tuning in via Zoom. Thanks for coming out. It's going to be a good show here tonight. I met Pamela about 10 years ago, hosting an event with at the book stall in Winnetka, and Rebecca Kaiser, the audience, was in conversation, and I feel like we've become friends since then. We are friends, I think I can say that. And we've kept up correspondence over the years, and I've been a huge fan. The Virgin's one of my favorite novels in the last 20 years. And I've been a huge fan since read everything. We hosted Pamela about a year ago for Natasha, really great, great novel. And so when Pamela asked if she could come to Chicago for event, it was a no-brainer. She'll be talking about someone else's book, Middlemarch, which is from this incredible new, well, not new, it's been around for a while, Bookmarked series. She'll be discussing that today, along with Joseph Scapellato, who is become a friend over the last year or so. He is the author of Made Up In, a novel which was published by Kenyon in 2019, right? And he's also visiting here from Bucknell. He's on sabbatical, and he was kind enough to take this on such short notice. Thank you so much for this. I think it's going to be a great conversation. We're super excited to hear what Pamela has to say about Middlemarch. Okay, thanks, and welcome, Pamela and Joseph.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Exile in Bucknell for having us here. Pamela, I really enjoyed reading this book. We talked about this. It was my first time reading Middlemarch. I read it. I'm on sabbatical, that's why I was able to read it so quickly. And after I read it, I took some notes, and then I read your book, and it just, it was such a delight. It was like being in a class or having a conversation with a really smart friend about books and life and growing up. And it was just a real delight. So thank you for writing this book. And I really love how in this book you've combined clear-eyed memoir with really insightful literary criticism. And they both, each of those elements complements the other throughout the book. And you'll be doing some memoir, and it'll springboard into criticism, and it'll springboard into memoir. And that gives it a kind of conversational feel for me that is very powerful and delightful. And so I guess I would just love to hear you talk a little bit about where and how Middlemarch and Imperfect Life started for you. How you came to write the book, what writing the book was like, what the actual process of it was like, what different phases it went through, and stuff of that nature.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for reading a 960-page book plus my book to get ready for this event. That was like pretty nice of you. And thanks to Javier and Kristen for letting me come. I love this bookstore. It's gorgeous, and it's a wonderful bookstore, and I'm really happy I can be here. So this book Middlemarch has always been my favorite novel. And I have thought about it all the time since I was 20 years old. And I'd even written a little bit about it, published a short piece on it once. And then in 2014, I think it was, Rebecca Mead came out with My Life in Middlemarch. And I thought, damn, oh my God, I can't believe how she thought of that, and I didn't think of it, and why didn't I think of it? And then I read the book, which is wonderful and excellent, but I thought, now it's done. I lost my chance to write about Middlemarch, didn't jump on it soon enough. Then I was at a friend's house, another writer, and I was introduced to a friend of hers who is the publisher of this series. And it turned out he was a neighbor. And I looked up the series, and I thought, oh, this is really cool. And I wrote him a kind of joking email. I was like, you have a great series, but you have no women in it. You need women, blah, 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 blah. And if you ever want me to do Middlemarch, ha, 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 I'll do it. And so about 9 months later, he said, yeah, did you want to actually do Middlemarch? And I was like, oh, yeah, I do. And we talked about Rebecca Mead's book and was there a place for another book? And finally, I just thought to myself, Middlemarch, I mean, how can there be room for only one sort of personal book on Middlemarch? It's such a capacious book. There's got to be room for one. So that's how that got started. And I wrote it during COVID, basically. It was very, luckily for me and my family, very quiet in the world in many ways. And I am sort of, I've said this in other interviews, I'm kind of an eternal student. So I read it slowly. It was very delicious to read it during the COVID. Very reassuring in some ways to read during COVID. It reminded me that there was my life wasn't just confined to my little house and my problems. And I just take a lot of notes and I winnow down those notes and I'm just sort of like a plodding, like good student. And that's how I wrote this book. It sort of, what you read is kind of how it came up.
Did you envision it as being memoir and criticism from the get-go?
Yes, because the whole series is like that. And so the big question for me was really though, how much memoir, how much criticism? And I wanted to feel that there was a balance. And before this event started, we were just talking about Steve Almond's wonderful book on Stoner that's in this series. I loved his volume, and I thought it had this wonderful, this beautiful mix of really. It's a book I love, Stoner. I knew the book, but I felt like he really opened up the book more for me, and yet he was very willing to get personal, but the personal didn't overshadow the. It never felt like self-indulgent, personal, so that was really my goal. How do I bring in personal, but not get with that, you know?
Yeah. I mean, that was my, from my experience reading the book, that was a goal that you achieved because it just seemed like we were naturally moving from one to the other, and each was kind of growing out of the other organically. You talk about this in the book, but for the benefit of the audience, either here or online, can you talk a little bit about your experiences of reading Middlemarch throughout your life? You mentioned that it was delicious to read during the pandemic, and you read it a couple times before. But kind of if you could give us a trajectory of how many times you read it, where you were at in your life, and what it meant to you.
So I've read it 4 times now, which it seems a little pathetic for one's favorite book, but it is a really long book. And it holds me for it holds me for a long time. I know people usually say, "Oh, I've read my favorite book 25 times." It sits with me for a long time. And so the first time I was 20, I was in college. I was really kind of an autodidact in college because even though I was a literature major. The way literature was taught where I was going to school was a lot of theory, like it was the 80s, that was really big, literary theory. And so literally you never had to read the actual books, you just had to read books about books.
Yeah.
But I really wanted to read the book, so I kind of worked my way through the classics on my own. And I had a summer roommate who was a big reader and a big reader of Victorians, and she said, "I read Middlemarch." I said, "Oh, yeah, I read Middlemarch." So I read it. I was really blown away. And again, one of the things I guess I tried to talk about in the book, I tried to convey because it's so meaningful to me, is the way, for me anyway, George Eliot makes you feel like the world is very big. Even though it's all about this one town, which is a provincial town, not even a big town, there's just something so big about her canvas, and I love that. And I was 20 years old. I didn't see that much of the world, and with the ways of thinking and the psychology of the characters and marriage, insight into marriage, into aging and illness, and it all just seemed very broadly. Then the second time I read it, I was married. It was about 10 years later. And I think it meant more to me from the point of view of, there are two main characters in Middlemarch. One is Dorothea, who was about the same age I was when I first read it. She's 19, and she's had what education a young, well-bred woman at that time had, which was none, you know, and so she's very naive about the world. But she thinks she has aspirations to do sort of Lady Bountiful aspirations. She's going to do wonderful things in the world. She's going to help her fellow man. And the other main character is Lydgate, who is very intelligent, London and Paris trained doctor. And he comes to this little provincial town thinking, I'm going to reform the very backwards practice of medicine in this town. And I think by the time I was reading it at 31, Lydgate's story is about how, so both the characters start with these very high ideals, and it's about what happens to those ideals. And by 30, that kind of meant more to me. Like, you know, my fantasies of what I was going to accomplish in life and, you know, had been tempered by experience. And I think I read it more through that lens at 30. Then the next time I read it, I actually had 2 little kids. And I think some of the things about empathy and self-sacrifice maybe spoke to me more at that point. And then the most recent time I read it was during COVID, while I was getting ready to read this book. And that brought up a whole bunch of other issues around unexpected setbacks in life and things that we can't control, and what happens when we suddenly feel we can't control the narrative of our life as much as we thought we could.
Yeah, you talk about that wonderfully in the book about the pain and thrill maybe later of surrendering your narrative, you know, having to open yourself up to another narrative.
Right, which is very hard. I mean, not a fun thing, but you sort of realize after you move through the shock of it, that it can be done.
Right. Yeah. Having heard you say that, I really love what you have to say about the deep comfort of reading Middlemarch, and how the relationship of the comfort that you feel in reading this book to, you say that the narrator gives you a sense of composure as a reader, or gives you a feeling of composure. You relate it to the authority and the patience and the generosity of the narrator. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. You know, whether it's that effect on you, or how you feel that Elliot does it, or how you try to do it in your own work.
I wish I knew how Elliot did it. I think she did it just because she was a genius and an extremely large-hearted. Large-hearted says, be a genius, and then you can write literature. Yeah, that was the one thing I kind of knew what I was going to talk about when I took on the project to write the book, which is who this narrator is. Who is this storyteller that tells the story of Middlemarch? And she does have this authority, and I'm very drawn to books that have narrators with that authority, which does often mean going back to the classics, because I think in the 21st century, we can't write books like that anymore. I mean, we sort of don't believe in narrative voices that have that much authority. So we have to go back. And in college, when I was a very confused and very unhappy young woman, that authority meant a lot to me. I felt like, oh, you know, here's somebody who's going to tell me what, you know, how it really is. Here's a voice that and look at the world and tell me about people and how people think and how marriage works the way it does and why people lie and steal. And, you know, I'm making a little bit of, I'm being serious and making a little fun of myself, because I had such a need for, like, yeah, at this age, I don't believe anybody really can tell you how it is and knows everything. But when I was 20, I sort of believed that, yes, I could find this voice that could tell me everything. And then just the sentences, which are so smart. And people don't talk about George Eliot as if she's this great stylist, and maybe she's not, but she's not a good stylist. I mean, she's funny. Her metaphors are amazing, and she has this just incredible insight.
agree. Yeah, I was struck by the way that she just spins out the logic of all these characters. I find comfort in that as a reader.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this person who's acting irrationally is doing it in a way to them that is rational. Right?
Yeah, she makes things make sense. Like a lot of, right, she makes you feel like, oh, exactly, I get why, this person is keeping this secret, or that person, cheated that person out of money or whatever.
Bolster, right?
It's bolster. It's not that she condones it, it's just that she makes you understand how people end up doing the things that they do. And that is very comforting to me anyway, because mystery is scary, Things make sense.
Yeah, I think there's maybe you can make the argument that there still is mystery even in the face of this step-by-step explanation of how these characters get to these, contorted conclusions.
Yes,
Because there's still kind of what is the prime mover of them question.
exactly, yeah.
But yeah, it's comforting at the same time.
But that initial sort of mystery of character is still there, but why we start with what we start with.
Right. Yeah, the nature. I was wondering if you could talk about. At one point you talk a little bit about how the narrator is the story, and it's this beautiful passage, early in your book about. I'm just going to read a little bit from it. George Eliot's stance toward her characters is like the meditator's stance toward thought, full of curiosity and wonder. The result is a tone of tolerance, humility, generosity, and humor. One of the most significant things I learned as a young writer was that what happens in the story is far less important than how the narrator tells that story. The narrator is the story. She is a way of looking at the world, a lens through which the reader sees everything. The narrator embodies the values of her constructed world, which come through via her tone, diction, and rhythm, when and where she employs comedy, and what she chooses to look at or ignore. You talk about some of her other works, that she speaks to the reader as if the reader too takes this view, has the result of prying open the reader's heart, increasing her compassion, clearing her vision. So the narrator is assuming that the reader is as generous and forgiving of the characters. That clarity is medicine. When I read Eliot, I am somehow better, more humble, more generous, more understanding, and I find life more fun. It's a good prescription. I would just love to hear you talk a little bit more about the argument that you're making here about the narrator is the story, how you, I don't know how that changes the way you read Eliot or how you've applied that in your own work.
That's a great question. I have to think if there's more I can say about it. I mean, that was a huge sort of milestone as a writer, is understanding that it's that voice that really becomes the story. And tell me again what the question is.
Yeah, is that
Sorry.
Yeah, is that something that you keep in your mind, keep in the back of your mind when you're composing or revising?
Oh,
or
yeah.
is your work ever, need to be revised towards making the narrative story or not?
Well, I never feel I have a book until I've found that voice and I know what that voice is. And that voice represents a point of view, a way of looking at the world. And when I have that way of looking at the world, then I know what the sound of the voice is, whether it's first person or third person, and the words start to come. And until that point, I may have material, but I don't have a book, right? I don't know. It's like we're actually sitting, people at home can't see it, but we're sitting near a wall with framed pictures, and it's like finding the frame, not a picture until you figure out what the boundaries are. So there's that, and I think there's some writers that, for instance, have a voice that's full of brooding and mystery, and it's not just about maybe the plot has a mystery in it or some darkness. It's that this voice looks at the world in such a way as to tell you that life is threatening and life has secrets that are dangerous. And, so I think we're, as readers, many of us are drawn to certain voices over other voices because they may reflect worldviews either that we have or maybe that challenge our worldviews. And I do think that about Eliot. I mean, I love, what you were pointing out, that she seems to assume that we're as smart as she is, which we're not. And she seems to assume we're as generous and empathic as she is, which we're probably not. But when I read her, I feel like she almost makes me feel like I have that potential, and that's what I get out of that.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me about reading Middlemarch was, and this is encapsulated in what you're saying, I think, is the way that Eliot is addressing the reader, or the narrator, I should say, is addressing the reader and kind of anticipating the reader's objections. Well, you might not think that Miss Brooke is this kind of person, but let me tell you, or hey, we haven't been in Casablanca, let's go in there.
That's a really big moment where she does that. So Dorothea, the young woman I mentioned, one of the two main protagonists, she's 19, she was very naive. She marries this much older man. Although I love that he's treated as elderly, and then you find out he's 45. But he acts like someone who's much older, and he's very dried up spiritually, and doesn't have a lot of juice in him. Anyway, and it turns out to be a terrible marriage, and you're seeing all this through Dorothea, who's struggling and doesn't understand why her husband is so cold and so doesn't seem to love her. And then all of a sudden George Eliot says, but it's time to go into Casablanca. Because I've read it so many times, even now I mispronounce his name, it's Casablanca. But isn't it time to see how he sees things? And then she goes into this long thing about how he sees things, and suddenly you understand his life completely differently, and not from the outside. It's like, what's with this guy? What's wrong with him? And he will never be somebody that you feel all warm and fuzzy about, but you understand. And he's really actually a very tragic character, because characters do have so much trouble feeling and are tragic.
Yeah, he feels that he ought to be feeling things that he's incapable of feeling.
It's so sad, yeah. And he knows it. Which really makes it tragic.
Yeah, and I love how Eliot, she presumes, it's almost like it's a pedagogical technique, right? Like speaking to your students as if they're just a little ahead of where they are, ability-wise, morally, ethically, developmentally, whatever. And you're kind of asking them to push themselves towards that, right? Doesn't always work with every student, right? But can. And it's almost like Eliot's doing that here, right? Like asking you to be bigger and better in your empathy.
Right.
There's a moment where you talk about as a young writer discovering the other in yourself that gives you permission to write about darker aspects of the human character, or even more mysterious ones outside of your experience, even. And you connect that to how Eliot had a similar experience. Perhaps she said in a letter, I think you quote, that she this not herself, someone who is not herself, takes over when she's writing. And do you find that this experience of getting somehow outside of, or inside of, or above, whatever spatial metaphor makes sense, yourself is not somehow necessary to write really meaningful fiction?
That's a really good question. I never make a huge pronouncement one way or another, because I think every writer's different. And that comment, actually, I think it was her second husband, she was widowed, although she wasn't technically married the first time, but her long-term partner, after he died, she married another man, and he wrote a biography of her, and I think that's what he said, that in the book, she had told him that in everything that she wrote, there was this other self that kind of at some point had to take over. And I do think, though, that's where some of the charge in really great literature comes from, or, when something's working. I think there's a charge that, like in this post-Freudian time, you can say comes from the unconscious, comes from like somehow being able to tap into stuff in ourselves that's not necessarily pretty, that's not necessarily rational, but we find a way to get that onto the page, a form for it, and that's what kind of makes the work alive. And I don't know, so I think for me, I have to kind of get there somehow. And it doesn't mean I go into like some big fugue state or anything. I know I'm at my best, and I know what my name is and all that.
It's not a seance.
No, it's not a seance, but there, ideally, and when it's lucky, I get absorbed enough in what I'm doing that, it's a little bit more dreamy than a normal, waking state where like, what am I gonna have for dinner, and I gotta call the doctor. So yeah, but I'm not sure everybody, it's that.
Yeah, so kind of state of immersion,
Right.
yourself falling back.
Right.
Flow state.
Isn't there that famous like Nabokov line who says like, my characters never take over, like I whip them like galley slaves. They do what I tell them to do. So I guess, yeah, so some, writers are probably just more, maybe more consciously controlling.
Yeah, thank you. I would bring up some points you made about morality and ethics in fiction. You note that we can be suspicious of novelists who are, writing novels that they're intending to use to better people or to improve people, and it's certainly not something that you hear people talk about very often, I don't think, or at least maybe not directly. I guess we could, we could about that. But that is Eliot's agenda, right? She wants to improve her readers. You also talk about how you don't see your novels as trying to improve anyone, and that fiction to you is not inherently a moral pursuit. You do talk about how reading this book did benefit you, right? And how sometimes fiction can expand your empathies and things like that. So if I'm understanding what you're saying here, you're saying that fiction can better people, but it's a kind of secondary incidental effect. Caused by readers recognizing themselves in the work, or in you evoking these meaningful to you emotional experiences. So, having said that, is that fair? Is that?
If you're having trouble figuring out exactly what I'm saying, it's because I'm still figuring out what I'm saying. No, really, that's the last chapter of the book, and that's like the stuff I'm still like working out in my own. I feel like I'm a bit in a lifelong struggle with like, well, what are, like as a novelist, like, am I doing anything with my life that is actually good for people? There's like that whole thing, and that I don't have an answer to, and so that chapter is kind of me wrestling with some of these questions that I don't think I have answered. And yes, George Eliot sort of was uniquely interested in some ways, I think, in making people better through her fiction, which I think if anybody watching this has read Eliot, it's like, I don't want to make people run from her books because that just sounds so deadly. But she was such a great artist that I don't think it doesn't come off as with moral lessons. Like Tolstoy was another person that had major issues around like what's good and making people good, but he was a great artist, and so like the fiction escaped his agenda often. It actually goes back to the other question you were asking. I more feel like what fiction does is it taps into those deeper, less conscious layers of our lives, and that's some of its value, that it does escape our agendas. And even when we're trying to be very right-minded, and I actually do think we're in another period where fiction in different ways than in Eliot's time is often trying to be really right-minded. And that can be that can be problematic, you know, I mean, it can, if the artist is good enough, it can work, but if not.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit more. So if I'm hearing you right, it's Eliot escapes being pedantic,
Yeah.
Tolstoy escapes being pedantic, but the worlds that they create in their fiction enact certain moral systems. Like characters are enacting these, and you can be inspired by that, or bettered by that, or not.
Or not, or you can just see how complicated life is.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I think really is more, if anything's moral about fiction, it's that it shows how complicated life is. And that it doesn't fit into our politics neatly, it doesn't fit into our philosophies neatly. And that to me is probably its biggest value, that it's not like directly pedagogical, it's not, you know, it escapes, good fiction escapes all the systems that.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe the argument could be made that in and of itself is creating some kind of moral argument, right? Like that, no, life isn't actually simple. You know, life is complex. You know, don't fall for supposedly simple solutions to supposedly simple problems, right? Build the wall, right? You know, I mean, like life is more complex than that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you about how you would respond to the argument that every decision we make as a writer is creating some kind of moral universe, or is making some kind of argument, like even on the craft level all the way down. So for example, the decision to you know, give men twice as many lines of dialogue in their fiction than women, right? Even if it's a subconscious decision. The decision to when you're talking about white characters, not mention the whiteness, but every time in their descriptions, but every time you talk about a black character, mention the blackness in their descriptions, right? Like that. I mean, an argument can be made, and is often made, that that is pushing for some kind of moral universe, whether or not the writer acknowledges it.
Right. Well, I think that's, you know, ideally we become more and more conscious of those moralisms encoded in what we write, that we see the, I mean, years ago, nobody even questioned that.
Right, yeah.
You know, that you know, you would talk about a black character's skin tone, but you wouldn't talk about a white character's, you know, skin. So it's, yes, I think all kinds of attitudes and moral stances are encoded in fiction, and all we can do is just sort of like keep becoming more conscious of what is there. But it's trickier when we try to put stuff there, I think. When we try to put moral agenda into fiction. So it's interesting that I'm saying that, and I'm also, you know, a huge fan. My favorite writer is a writer who was trying to do that, but she did it in a very sophisticated way.
Well, I think I'll ask you maybe one more question, and then I think we should probably turn it over to the audience. I think that time is. Yeah. Okay. What have you been reading lately that's been knocking your socks up?
Yeah, so
Favorite socks?
I am wearing socks and they're still on, but so two books I read earlier this year that I adored. One is new, one's not. Ruth Ozecki's The Tale. I can't believe I'm blanking on the name.
Tale for the Time Being?
No, the new one.
Tale.
Oh, Love and Darkness? Why? I can't believe I spaced on the title. Anyway,
It's not a title.
the Book of Form and Emptiness.
There it is, yes.
Oh, God. Okay, Book of Form and Emptiness. I loved it. I mean, there's a sort of Zen Buddhist component, which I'm very attracted to. That interests me. But I love her work generally, and it's a book kind of about mental illness, but I've never seen anything like this before. It's from inside a boy who's considered mentally ill, and you get inside him so convincingly that you're not sure he really is mentally ill. You see what other people see, but when you're seeing him from the inside, so it's interesting. It is kind of like Eliot. It's like when you're inside of people empathically enough, there's a question, so that, and she leaves it wonderfully ambiguous, like, is this kid sort of really, is his reality really challenged, or is it not? I loved it. And then I also love the writer William Maxwell, and I read the book The Chateau, which was the one novel because I hadn't read, and I'd always read that it was somehow not as good as this other stuff. And a friend of mine read it, she said, this is fabulous. And I read it and it is fabulous. So I don't know why it's sort of undervalued compared to his other novels. But it's about a young couple that travels to France on a belated honeymoon very soon after the end of the Second World War. And it's funny, and it's sort of about that fantasy we have when we're traveling. We're gonna get the authentic experience, and we're gonna really bond with the natives, and they're gonna love us. And like, they go and they don't understand what people even speak French. But like half the time you're like, are these people ripping us off? Are they playing us for the fool, or did I just insult them? And it's sort of this great thing about how we have trouble sometimes bridging cultures, cultural differences, but with humor, and he's always very insightful. And then, right, I'm in the middle of a book right now that I love, Marie Young-Lee's Evening Hero, which is wonderful, and is both very funny, like it's got two timelines, a contemporary one and a past. And the contemporary one is wonderful satire, and the past one is really heartbreaking about the Korean War, sort of before the Japanese occupation, during and after with the American occupation, and the terrible cost. And it's really interesting to read a book that's so funny and so dark, and she can balance these two tonal registers, and it really works. And then I should say my friend Robin Black, who wrote a book for this same series that the Middlemarch book is, Mrs. Dalloway, and it's wonderful. It's just really, really good. That's great.
It's a good end of a good summer reading list. Well, thank you. Let's turn it over to questions from the audience, whether you're remote or here in the finance program. Yes, Rebecca.
So I am team Mill on the Floss. Here's my question. So I've never understood why that is not considered her greatest novel, and why Middlemarch. And especially, I'm wondering with you, because you write really tight, compact, hothouse kind of novels. And Mill on the Floss is like a tight, cause and effect. And no shade on Middlemarch, but like, it's like a lot of novels stitched together. And you're reading along and you're like, wow, I just read 50 pages on church politics. And then you're back in this, it's going in so many directions. It's one of those kind of a big baggy sack of a thing. And wonderfully so, but why is that the one that you like? Rather, would it hit you at the right time, or do you think that is her best novel?
That's such a great question. I love Mill on the Floss. Well, I love Mill on the Floss. Why Middlemarch? Well, at one point in the book I say this, I love the essay form. And I think there's something about the combination of essay, like you say, the digressions where suddenly I'm reading about like 17th century medicine, and I love that stuff. I love it. There's something that's like, Middlemarch feels like a combined essay novel to me. And so I guess that's why. Also, I just think there's so many, Mill Plus is great, but I love the breadth of the variety of characters in Middlemarch. They're just every class, every type of education, every sort of, I feel like I'm reading about the whole human race. And that somehow makes it greater to me than the normal class. But greater is very subjective. So,
well, you're not alone. I mean, like many, that's the book that people, at least here, even if they haven't read it, like that's the book. Right.
Do you feel a similar way about, to Rebecca's question, about War and Peace versus
that's, I like War and Peace a lot. I mean, it's a great book, but I feel like Hannah Karenina is a great book. But a lot of people don't follow that, you know, and it's like War and Peace. And War and Peace is more like the essay
Yeah.
and it's
More
more
like a
boring. Or maybe I just don't care about the war. I mean, I even am sort of interested in the war stuff, but I don't know.
No, but there are like 100 pages on crop rotation. There's maybe that's Anna Karenina.
I think that's an
It is Anna Karenina.
But yeah, I don't know. I mean, War and Peace, I like more feel of what you said about Middlemarch. So it's kind of this big baggy, you know, kind of like diffuse thing. Like I actually feel Middlemarch is really tightening it together, like all the disparate. It is many different stories, but I feel like they're so well knit. So.
Good question. Other questions? Questions in mind?
We don't have any online, but I have a question.
Okay.
So we were talking about these other really good books on music. I'd like to ask this question to our guests. If you could write a 33 or 3rd book on your favorite album, what would it be? This is for both of us.
No. You're the guest.
Oh my God, I said, London Calling, the Clash's London Calling, that could be a really cool one.
There's no Clash 33 or 3rd,
There isn't.
which is weird.
Well, maybe.
Yeah, there you go.
I mean, I don't feel like equipped to write about music particularly, but that is a great album. I mean, Born to Run, but like that's so obvious, you know. It's where darkness and the end of town. Yeah, maybe I'd go for the Clash.
There's a void fill. There's not a single Clash.
Another
165.
project.
Seriously, and yeah, I think it's a great album. And some of my favorite ones are by writers, John Darnielle
Yeah.
and Jonathan Rutland. They've written novels based on the albums, which is pretty
Yeah.
interesting.
Well, now you do have to answer that.
It would probably be a Flaming Lips album.
There's already one.
Yoshimi?
No. What's the other big one?
Versus. Oh, yeah. The one, the album that was multiple CDs, and you were supposed to get multiple stereos and play them, and you could pause some. Yeah, you were supposed to kind of like mix master your own album. Experiment in the late 90s.
Oh.
I forget the name of it.
It's a weird thing.
Yeah.
All right.
Do we have time for one last question? Last question for you. What is something that you wish that you knew about either writing or reading way before you ended up writing?
Way before I ended up writing.
Yeah, so kind of like advice that you would be happy to give your younger versions of yourself.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I don't think there's a way to save time on these things, unfortunately, but that the fact that your favorite writers, the ones you really admire, are not necessarily the ones you can write like. Because, well, George Eliot's my favorite writer. I don't like anything like George Eliot, and I had to learn that the hard way, that I was not going to write this expansive, you know, panoramic, whatever, with this this authoritative voice, which again, like I had to learn that, in 1995, you can't really write with that narrator. It just doesn't sound right anymore. That you have to come up with something that is natural for your own time. And sometimes you have to learn to write against your favorite writers. And I really had to learn to write against George Eliot. Like I had to realize that is not what I do. I do this other thing. But I don't think there's any way to save time. Learning that, you just have to kind of do it wrong a lot of times.
I think that's a really wonderful point that you made. Yeah, because so often the advice is, who are your favorite writers? Read everything that you can from them and see what you can take and apply from that. And that is valuable, but in the end, like, what are your what is your stride? What are your rhythms, right? And are they gonna match up necessarily with your writing?
I had a writing teacher once who said that it's the writing that you respond most hostilely towards that you learn the most from. And he was right. Yeah, he was right in some ways. There were writers that would exasperate me. I just did not like reading them, and I now understand a little bit more why, because they were just threatening in some ways. Either the content was threatening, or the style was threatening, and yeah, it's often those writers that we actually learned away from, more than the ones we really love and admire.
Yeah, it pays to be omnivorous in your reading.
Yeah, and it pays to take classes where you are forced to read stuff that you wouldn't read on your own.
I hear you're offering one. Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's been such a delightful chat with you.
These two books are both on sale in the store and also online. They'll be signed. I will watch them personally sign these books for you. Go online, come to the store. We'll also have books. We'll have other books from Pamela, her middle grade novel, and again, one of my favorite novels of all time, The Virgins. Buy to your heart's content. Thanks for coming out. Thanks for everybody for being here, and thank you too for such great conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks.